Good afternoon. So I'm Tobey. I'm a new SRE tech lead at Elastic. I've only been there for about 6 weeks. We'll talk about that in a few minutes because actually some cool stuff has already happened. So this talk I gave in Americas, it's changed a little bit. So we're going to talk about some stuff that's near and dear to my heart. One-on-ones, I'm going to tell you some stories. We're going to talk a little bit about psychology, polyvagal theory, intersectionalism and resilience engineering, and ways that one-on-ones can help you advance your career and advance availability in your organization. So the cool thing about this slide is the template at Elastic says, find a quote from somebody famous or important and put it in here. So I did, but it's my quote. So how can SREs influence availability at company-wide scale? We all struggle with this, especially as individual contributors, right? I have the privilege of being in the leadership team now. But most of my career, I've been an individual contributor. And what we struggle with is we have all this work that comes our way, and we hear about DevOps and resilience, and boy, these things are so exciting. But inevitably, to put these things in action, we have to make influence across the organization to really improve robustness and resilience of our organizations and our tech stacks. So I've told this story before at conferences, and I feel like it works well here too, and I'll get to why. So in 1999, I dropped out of college and got my first job as a junior systems administrator at a stock trading company. And it was about like 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sitting in the data center at the console like you used to do, right? You'd sit in the data center, the machine's whirring, right? It's super loud and cold. And the senior admin comes in and walks by and goes, hey, Tobey, jump on that machine. And he points, and there's a Spark station sitting right there. Jump on that machine right there. And I already had root, right, because it's all our login. And go kill the wave D process, right? The wave is some bidding process where you would put out a sale, and then other people would bid on it. And it was kind of important to the stock traders. So I log into the machine, happy. And the part that I haven't told you yet is most of my education was on Linux. I taught myself Unix or Linux, and I didn't really realize that Solaris had some differences that were pretty critical. So I typed kill all wavedD, and then I start panicking as I see the console start raining down a shutdown and the kernel panics basically because all the processes have just been killed. And about 2 seconds later, the phone rings, right? And one of our jobs is to pick it up. It's a data center. And before I got through the word center, the trader's like, what the is going on down there? And I'm panicking. The senior admin gets him calmed down. And we reboot the machine, it comes up, and everything's fine. And the point of that story is, I still think about that experience all the time, right? It's been 20 years. But the stress of that situation being so early in my career and that I had bet my entire life on it, basically, that's how I felt, right? So I had bet my whole life on this job to enter into this field of tech. And all of a sudden, I'm like, is they going to fire me? Because this is a trader. They have all the power in trading companies. And it was fine. Like, we got through it. But the point is trauma is the extreme stress that overwhelms your ability to cope. And as SREs, I'm sure we've all experienced those situations where the system is down, we're panicking, we don't have all the context we need to fix it, and what do we do, right? And how many of us have experienced that? And like where you have those moments that you still think of pretty frequently. Yeah. So another thing, I like to introduce, I heard somebody talk about fight or flight yesterday. I think it was James Wu. And there's this really cool new field happening in psychology called polyvagal theory. And what it says is that fight or flight is too limited, and that most vertebrates actually have a third level of engagement that's called social engagement. And so this explains some things that didn't really make sense to me before in the fight or flight model, right? So why do teams of SREs that have been buried under on-call work for months on end, how do they keep surviving? How do they not just burn out and crumple into a heap of ash? And part of that's social engagement, right? We look to our peers and we have trench humor. And we go out for beers and we complain at each other, right? And that social engagement is how we deal with that stress I mean, there are other ways to do it too, right? Like going out and doing yoga or running, which are the things that I choose. But really, that's in the moment where you look to your herd, basically, and say, hey, well, so the senior lions aren't panicking, or the senior deer aren't panicking, and decide and judge your behavior based on that. So this is pretty cool. The slide notes will have links to information on this. But I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about some of the other aspects of one-on-ones. So another story. I worked for a really large internet service a couple years ago that is a telemetry company with a side gig in streaming a ton of video. And they might have a red logo, and it might be shaped like this. And there's this service that runs centrally to everything, all the API calls, where it loads thousands and thousands of scripts. Every day, these things get uploaded and replaced live with thousands of RPS going through it. And this team had had a couple of incidents recently. So we put together a postmortem, right? We built a report. Another one of the engineers on the team built it. We presented it in front of everybody in the auditorium. The whole engineering team was there. And that all went swimmingly. And then we started the Q&A. I might not do a Q&A, and you'll understand why in a moment. Because what happened was, we got a lot of people coming up standing up, putting their hand up, and we call on them, and they'd be like, well, this is more of a statement than a question. You know, and so, and then it was kind of a pile-on, right? And we've seen this, a lot of us have seen this in incident reviews, right? People have that urge because they have that pain or they have opinions that they pile on. And that got me thinking that, like, this is kind of broken, right? Because that team had been through a ton in just a few weeks with the instability of their service. And I thought, there's got to be a better way, but I didn't figure it out then. So some more theory. How many people are tired of resilience engineering? Hearing about it? That's great. How many people have heard about resilience engineering at this conference? It's been coming up a lot, I hope. So it's this, what I think of resilience engineering as, so Ryan Franz recently posted this on Twitter saying, as you start to learn this, especially for folks like us, it kind of rewires your brain. But I think for SREs and people adjacent to us, it's more of finding a way to talk about stuff that we've felt viscerally in a way that's scientific, that has science behind it and research behind it. And that's what gets me really excited. And so, like, it's not so much a rewiring, but just aligning to something that we can communicate clearly with each other. So there's a lot of different ways that resilience is, people talk about it, right? The definition is kind of slippery. So I like to talk about, like, the origin of the term, which is from shipbuilding. When they would test timber, they would test the resilience of timber. So it's literally your ability to weather the storm, right? And in our organizations, when we talk about resilience, that's really what we're building. And it's not just in the tech stack, right? That's where we tend to focus. But what we really want to do is build our organizations and our tech stacks, the socio-technical system, to weather the storm. And I've been thinking about this a lot, too. And something I wanted people to take away, because where I think DevOps went wrong, or what, I don't know if DevOps went wrong, but like where things went sideways for DevOps, is people decided that it was a thing that they should do, and then we created positions and titles and products and technological solutions. And there were a bunch of us that were like, wait, no, it's not about CI/CD pipelines, which are great, but about the fact that CI/CD pipelines make it easier for us to work with engineers because it defines a boundary where engineers put their code and then we take it and put it in production automatically. But it's really that connection where we communicate with our peers across our organizations. And so what I want people to take away with resilience engineering, it's intersectional like feminism. And what I mean by that is all of us can apply it, whether you're a product manager or an SRE or a software engineer or a finance person, human resources. Because it's the resilience of the organization that we want to strive for, because the services availability will follow the organization's resilience. Because if you have problems in, say, accounting, where they don't have the capacity to help you go and increase limits with Amazon because the money's not available because somebody's got to go sign off on it. That can create an availability issue, for example. Or if you've got to renew a contract and legal can't get it done, then the service might go down because a SaaS you depend on is gone. So just keep that in mind a little bit. I also think there's some overlap with feminism, which I love, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. So last story. In late October 2018, GitHub experienced its largest outage in history. It was down for 24 hours. I mean, it was partially available for people, but it was basically down for most people. So what had happened there was a triple fault. So the first thing that happened was a piece of network gear failed in one of the data centers. No big deal, right? There's redundancy, there were multiple links, not a big deal. Technician gets in there and starts to repair it. They make a very innocent, minor mistake, and connectivity is lost between the primary and secondary data center for 43 seconds. And in that 43 seconds, the database decided that both sides of the database decided that they were the writers and accepted rights. So we have a split brain. So to resolve this, the responders decided to restore from backups. And the important thing that I got out of that incident was, and this is where the one-on-one incident review I'm going to get into in just a second comes from, is watching this incident unfold, right? I wasn't there very long at the time, and I was watching it unfold, and I saw people doing things like saying, hey, Bob, when's the last time you took a break to go get some food and water and maybe take a little nap? Or, hey, you've been on here this call for 8 hours. It's time for you to go get some sleep. Who's your relief? We'll page them. And I hadn't really seen much of this before, right? Most other places I had worked, we were all kind of driven to follow through to the end, right? I'm going to stick to it until it's done. And I was really taken back. And then I thought about that previous story where there was that pile-on, and I was already gearing up through the incident for what we're going to do in the incident review, as one does. And then go back to the first story I told you, and I was thinking about the people who were working on that, and what's the impact on them in being in this stressful situation for 24 hours? Because even if they were off taking time, most of us are pretty engaged with our work, they were probably still stressed out. So hence, the one-on-one debrief. So this is kind of silly, right? Like, this is not serious. But I want to show, the intersection of resilience engineering and psychology, and then probably the most important feature of the one-on-one incident debrief is that it's not a pain in the neck to schedule. Because if you've ever tried to get people in multiple time zones on multiple continents into the same meeting, it is nearly impossible. And in resilience engineering, one of the things that it kind of taught me was to get as many perspectives on the incident as I can. Because the goal is to create as much learning as we can. So by talking to everybody in a one-on-one scenario, we're able to draw out those individual perspectives without influence for the group, right? Like, what I'm telling you is not the raw story that I experienced. I'm filtering it. One, because, well, I'm not under, I was under NDA when we wrote the big report. I can't tell you everything that's in there, right? But we filter when we're in a group, right? Because you got to be a little bit more polite. Some people cuss less. I don't. There's different things that we do, so we behave differently. And it's a little bit more sustainable in ways, in that you don't have these big groups coming together. You don't have this additional stress of the review. So I'm going to step through. So what the incident debrief ended up being was a really simple agenda of a few questions that we asked everybody that was in the incident to draw out their perspectives and to make them feel supported. You schedule them about 30 to 60 minutes, and you don't record it. It's just, we did them all over Zoom because GitHub is a remote company, as is Elastic, so spread all over the globe. Oops. So obviously the first thing you do is introduce each other, right? You don't always know everybody. And go over the agenda, which is basically the list of questions. But then I think the most critical part of the whole thing is informed consent. And so that's when you talk to people about what am I going to do with this perspective that you give me? Because what we want to foster is vulnerability. And I don't mean that in, I wrote this thing in C and it's riddled with null pointer exceptions and buffer overflows. What I mean is human vulnerability. And it means that when we get into a situation where I feel safe with you and you feel safe with me, our discussion goes deeper and we're running less filters and our perspective comes out less contrived. So an important part of the informed consent, one of the things we did was, I would say, for example, I'm going to be taking notes in real time because that's my style. And when I'm done, these notes will go into a Google Doc that is only shared with the people working on the incident investigation, and afterwards we delete them. And they're never showed to management. And we got agreement from that from management at GitHub. In your org, you probably want to do that just to help provide that additional level of safety. And so that's what I mean by consent. Let people know what you're going to do with the data. So the first question, what was your role in the incident? So it might be like, oh, I just showed up to deliver the pizzas. But very often what happens is in this question, it's irrelevant. And like half the people just divulge the entire story in one go. And that's okay, right? Because the point is to get the story, not to follow the questions. So those questions are to lead people through the narrative. But some people are great at telling stories and just let them rip. We had this guy, Ross. He is great at telling stories. And he basically talked for 60 minutes straight, and I just typed the whole time, and it was great. So second question, what surprised you? We usually have that in incident reviews and things like that, right? What were the surprises? Incidents are surprises. But we learned interesting things. Like, we had a couple of engineers say, I didn't realize the database is that important. And, SRE me, I would have never uncovered that myself, right? Because I've been like, of course everybody knows the database is critical, right? But we found out a couple of people, because they were working deep in the Rails stack, they didn't really ever see a database connection. They didn't even really understand, they didn't have a lot of exposure to the fact that they were going to a MySQL database or that it had replicas, because it wasn't really in their everyday line of work. How long did you work on the incident? So here, it's not really important to get accurate times. The idea is to find out, are people overworking? Are they burning themselves out? Are there heroes that are repeatedly working 4 and 5 hours or something like that, right? So you're just looking for trends here and really just to get people talking again. Were you able to get the support you needed? And so this is to draw, again, did your manager check in on you, right? Did you have to page anybody and did they respond, right? Did the remote hands pay attention to instructions? Which, good luck on that. Do you feel that the incident was preventable? So most of us are like, well, yeah, of course, right? Except that you heard the story I told you about the GitHub outage, and it wasn't really, right? Because nobody could have anticipated when that hardware was going to fail, and that there would also be a mistake in replacing it, and then also that there was just an unknown, just nobody realized that the database was configured in a way that would allow for split brain. And we never would have known unless we had that series, very, very specific series of events. What actions do you feel good about? So we try to kind of go back and forth, right? Good cop, bad cop. So what do you feel good about? People said, like, I love how everybody checked in on each other and said, how are you doing? Or say, go get some rest. And it was a good place to celebrate the good things. What do you think could have been better? So as we go on, these are going to feel a little bit more overlapping. And the idea is to increase the resolution of the narrative as you go. And often you get new content each time. When we originally started this, we knocked out this list of questions in like 3 or 4 hours as a team. I wrote the initial list, and then we kind of tweaked it together. And there was some, these are kind of overlapping, but we decided just to go with it. And it turned out that we did get different answers each time. And so it's not just, was this preventable, but like, you know, it would have been nice if we had better tools in the data center for checking cables, for example. What did you, and I usually add the word personally, what did you personally learn from this incident? And so this is kind of cool because if you ask a group, like if I asked you all, what did you learn from this talk? We probably wouldn't get to each of your perspectives because you're each going to get something different, I hope, from this talk. And so that's the idea, is I can get the individual perspectives, and then at an incident report, I can stack all those up and then expose them to the whole organization. It's really cool. And the database one came up here again. It was kind of neat. What do you think we can do to prevent recurrence? So my favorite was the network engineers, because they cuss a lot like I do. And they usually just tell you exactly how it is, right? Like that stinking piece of hardware and that vendor, and oh gosh, that piece of firmware. And then you get people that are like, well, I kind of wish that we had, a little bit better support in our library for accessing the database to do X, Y, Z. And so you collect all those perspectives, and then you could feed that back in your product pipeline. Did our tools and documentation serve you well? This one's more relevant to this room probably, right? A lot of us work on those tools and that documentation. This is where you find out where runbooks maybe are a little out of date. And in fact, GitHub did discover that in that incident. And you find out that some tools had dependencies on production that you didn't anticipate and required manual overrides. And these things are inevitable. And so our job is to uncover it and then schedule remediation items and push them through to production. This one's my personal favorite. Did you practice self-care? And my favorite thing about this is most of the people like at GitHub or Elastic would say, well, yeah, because that's the culture of the company is to take care of yourself. Not every company has that culture, but it's nice to have. But the other thing that this does is it reinforces for the next incident that you should take care of yourself, because I'm going to ask you about it when we do the retrospective. And so no, that's not how we do it, right? But but that asking, it keeps putting it out there, right, and keeps it in people's minds that they should take care of themselves. And then finally, for that big incident was, can you think of anyone else we should talk to? We started with a list of about 15 people. And by the end of it, I think it was like 36 people we interviewed. And we had 36 perspectives that we could go through and comb for data to put in the incident reports. The internal one ended up being, I think, like 15, 20 pages. And then the external one's still out on GitHub's blog. It's a little bit shorter because there's less detail in it. And all that perspective came from these interviews, right? The technical analysis is kind of short, right? That's all in the public RCA. But all the stuff that we drew out from these interviews made the internal one a lot more rich and useful. So that's the one-on-one incident debrief. So if you take this home with you, I encourage you to adapt it to your organization, and especially your culture, and figure out what questions drive the behavior that you want over time, because if you use this repeatedly, you can use it to drive behavior in incidents. Because people are anticipatory and will anticipate what they might have to respond to. And I like also that people are in the mindset of like, oh God, I'm gonna get grilled in front of the whole class. So please do try it. Tell me how it goes. So that was one-on-ones for debriefs. The other place that one-on-ones are really powerful is in building your personal network and driving organizational change. Like I was saying at the beginning, we all struggle at times with, okay, I have this issue in production, and there's an architectural issue, and I've got to go get buy-off from product, but product sent me over to management, and management said, well, go talk to product, and product's like, well, try with the engineers, and then they can go talk to their man. How do we get people to actually get this stuff done? And one of the best ways that I've found to really quickly build influence in an organization is to schedule a whole bunch of one-on-ones with people that you find interesting, or that maybe pop their heads up every once in a while in incidents. And you just talk to them. So you don't need to have this kind of preset agenda. You could do one like that, but I don't. I just schedule it and be like, hey, I think that you're really cool and you work on some stuff that's relevant to my interests. So let's have a chat and just find out if we're aligned and if we can help each other out. And just doing that part can start to achieve some of these goals of DevOps, right? Which is these communications across lines. One of the first people I had a one-on-one with at Elastic was a lady in legal that works on compliance. And it wasn't even just a couple weeks later, she hit me up and said, hey, I'm working on this thing for GDPR, and there's some technical stuff that's in here that I need to understand, and could you help me work through it? And so we had a great conversation. We talked for an hour about it, and we talked about kind of how our system holds data and what data we collect, and what actions we should take and what advice we should give to our people inside the company. And that wouldn't have happened if we didn't start that relationship before, right? Because she might not have known who to call. And so by doing that, that's how you build that network. So the key thing I mentioned earlier, and why the slide says this, is that vulnerability is what creates human connection. I mean, there are whole books on this, but the short version is, in a vulnerable context, when we're looking at each other, and you don't have to do eye contact, that's a whole different thing. But just being present and being willing to show your vulnerability and lead with vulnerability, other people will follow because humans naturally mirror each other's behavior, whether we like it or not. And you get this deep relationship building, you get more truth. You get to learn things like that you might not learn in, say, if somebody's presenting to me the network architecture of Elastic's SaaS, they're going to tell me probably the official version if it's a class, right? Because if you have a wide audience, you've got to cater to all the different people. But on a one-on-one situation, people can assume like, oh, Amy's seen Elasticsearch before, and she's seen tons of container orchestrators and knows what Docker is. So we can focus on the parts that I don't know and the parts that they have to offer. So coming back to resilience, how many people have had problems in their organization where instructions or desires from, say, the top of the organization, as they filter down, suffer from the telephone game, and by the time it gets to all of us down at the bottom, the message is kind of muddy and unclear, and execution suffers as a result? I mean, it's probably all of you, so I'm not even gonna, right? Because we've all seen it before. It's the other cool thing about doing this one-on-one thing is it creates another mesh inside the company of communication, right? So when I have a relationship with people in engineering and over in legal and finance, now when things are unclear, we know who to talk to, and we can schedule these conversations to clear things up, and then have that network effect of broadcasting messages that may be suffering from loss in other communication channels. So the other really cool trick with this is you can fly under the radar. You don't need permission to schedule a one-on-one. In almost every org I've worked at, you could schedule these things, nobody'd ever even notice, right? If you get the other person to agree, usually you have enough slack in your schedules to say, I need a half hour of your time, just, we can catch up, find out what our responsibilities are and how we can work together. And now you're creating this network without it kind of being officially sanctioned. And I don't have this problem today, but in other places I've worked where it's a little bit more, is it okay to say balkanized around here? I don't. Where there's these strong boundaries and teams don't talk to each other and people don't talk to each other. But you can start to break that down just by going around the boundaries and having the conversations. So how can SREs influence availability at the organizational scale again? I was trying to come up with a summary, and I Googled the words empathy and change, thinking that might be a good way to find some inspiration for how to end this and tie this up. And the first thing I came across, this article by Patty Sanchez on Harvard Business Review, right? Which Doesn't really probably ring for this crowd a lot, right? We're not big Harvard Business Review readers. But I thought it was really useful because as we look at kind of where SRE is going and the ways that we can increase the reliability and resilience of our organizations, it really comes down to changing the organization and letting the system follow. And so the secret to leading organizational change is empathy. This is something that's being sold to execs through Harvard Business Review, and I thought that was really cool because I'd like to see more of that from leadership too. And so that's where I'm gonna leave you. And with that, I'm Amy Tobey. That's my Twitter handle. Everybody is hiring, and so is Elastic. If you are interested, you can talk to me or one of my peers over here at Panos, and we can talk to you about what's available. And with that, I guess we have a few minutes for questions.
Okay, we have mics on the go. If people have questions, pop their hands. Over there. There's a hand up over there if you can.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned getting management support for removing records of your one-on-ones. Was that also communicated from management that this was a supported directive?
Yeah.
Why?
It wasn't that at GitHub. I haven't had an opportunity to try this again at Elastic yet, but it was there explicit that these were reserved just for incident investigations and were not to be repeated outside.
Question over here.
Hi. What are some of the obstacles that you face when dealing with a one-to-one? Like, for example, when we try to do some learning reviews, some people will defer to their manager, or they say they're too busy. Are there other things that you encounter?
Probably the biggest one is kind of getting into a headspace where you kind of calm yourself, and because one of the keys of it is that people are usually really upset about things, right? Like I mentioned the network engineers. So they get really upset because they take it personally when their network fails. And so they get kind of cranky and sometimes get spun up when they're talking about it. And so that can be challenging to you, the interviewer, because you start to build to kind of absorb some of that stress. In terms of organizational stuff, with incident debriefs, it's usually not a problem, right? It's like, incident happened, you were involved, I need you there. And I don't give them an option usually for incidents, right? It's like, no, you're gonna come. We had a couple people cancel, but if you miss one or two, it's not the end of the world. And usually it's like, look for somebody else on the team that has the context, or which I've done also.
Hi, I wanted to try to get an idea on what is the underlying target or what you're trying to achieve, because I see that this can have a... I see a lot of approaches. So are you trying to get to the root cause or contributing factors of an incident? Are you trying to apply some cultural change to the company, reducing stress levels, all of the above?
All of the above. But you mentioned the main one, though, is getting all the contributing factors and really trying to uncover the narrative, right? So by getting all those individual narratives, that lets us construct a shared narrative that has more resolution and it has, kind of greater resolution in the contributing factors.
I want to say thank you for the talk first. That was really, it landed really hard with me. Thank you. I was wondering, how have you seen this sort of possibly go off the rails, or the mistakes people make when trying to implement this, or guidelines for keeping it in a safe way of doing it?
I haven't had that problem. I was fortunate at the last couple places I've worked, having people on the team. The people that tend to want to participate in the interview process are usually ready to handle that emotional load. And we usually talk about it ahead of time, right? Is that this is emotional labor. And I didn't really bring that up, but that's an important thing to mention is all of these things are emotional labor. And so accounting for that lets you center and control your energy so that you don't end up exhausted and in a bad place where you absorb all those negative emotions. So yeah, is that what you're asking?
That's helpful, thank you.
Okay.
Hi there. I was wondering, we routinely do group incident reviews, and I love the idea of a one-to-one, but I'd be worried that it might be appropriate for your once every couple of years mega disaster, but we do a lot of learning from your every month kind of mini disaster, and is there a way to scale that down that means that the overhead of all those interviews could be managed into a routinely task?
Yeah, so the GitHub process was we used it for majors, basically. There wasn't an official designation of major, but we would basically, as a team, decide and be like, should we do the big process for this? And it's really just a judgment call of, is there additional stuff that we think we can uncover through this process? And if it's, because a lot of incidents are shallow, right, that we deal with on a monthly basis. It's like, oh, that component failed because there was a bug, and we rolled it back, and there's an action item to go and fix the bug. You don't need to go interview people for that, right? That's very straightforward. But when there's like a cascading failure or something crosses teams, that tends to be a clue that maybe digging in a little deeper will yield some really good learning for the organization.
And would you say that sometimes you could combine the two and do both, or is it one or the other, do you think?
I'm sorry?
Could you combine both approaches, have a group session and session as well? Or?
Yeah, so like the way I pictured it happening was, doing all the interviews and then having a group presentation of the results without Q&A. But yeah, I mean, it depends on the organization, right? Because if you have a kind of empathetic organization, GitHub is one, Elastic is one, then you don't have to worry about that as much. And then you have other organizations that I've been at where, the focus of the culture is a little bit less empathetic, I'll say. Then you might have more tendency towards that behavior that can snowball out of control.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, so thanks for the talk. It's kind of a similar question to the last one. As you're going through it, it seems like an awful lot of work. And I'm just wondering, in one of these examples, like how long do one of these things take? Like, I think you mentioned 15 people that were interviewed, then you had to write up all the notes, then you had to share it all. And maybe a follow-on to that, you say afterwards that you actually delete all the stuff. So do you not kind of lose learnings over time by deleting as well? So 2 questions. How long does it take? And then is there a concern that because you're throwing stuff away afterwards that you're actually losing some of the learnings? Yeah, and so that comes down to how you compile the analysis, right? So the idea is to expose those narratives and you build your big detailed internal incident report, right? And you might miss a few things in that extraction process. So there's the hours of interviews. The cool thing about that is you can divide and conquer. So you can spread it out. If you have an SRE team, you have 4 or 5 people that can go out and do interviews. So interviewing 36 people isn't just me sitting down and doing 36 interviews, which would be exhausting. I did do about half of them, and it was really exhausting. At the end of that week, I was just destroyed. Yeah, getting rid of that, like, that's a local decision to make, right? Like, you don't have to delete them. But the reality is the older an incident gets, the less valuable its data is. Because the context is gone, people have moved on, the system changes, people are hired and fired. So I don't think that you should hold on to it forever, just because some of it can be pretty spicy. Right? You get a network engineer going off, and sometimes that rant leads into, I always pick on network engineers because they're very ranty. I love them. And they start bitching about management. And you don't want to leave that in the record, right? Because that's not really relevant unless you can extract something from like, oh, we think there is a communication issue between the directors and the managers. That might be something you put in a report, but not the kind of raw version. So it is very labor intensive. And so the question is if an incident is a or unplanned investment in education for your company, as John Alspaugh says, and I truly believe this, then it's how much do you want to invest in your learning? And so is that time worth it? So for that incident where GitHub was down for a day,
It was absolutely worth it because one, we wanted to fix that so that we wouldn't be in that situation again. Two, we owed it to our customers to do that in-depth analysis. And then we also got the ability to take that and turn it into a really cool public postmortem. So it was an investment, and it was very deliberate, and adjust to flavor at your, what energy you have available.
So my question, I think, was hinted at in your answer. Hi, Amy, over here.
Oh, it's you again.
Yeah, it's me again. My question, you've described a very hub and spoke architecture, right, where you're the hub and the information flows to you. And I just wonder if there are other architectures that you could conceive of. And the reason why I asked that question is I could imagine I'd want to understand how I could spread this in a way such that you train other people. Are the people who are going through the incident review, are they possibly themselves possible to be able to start to conduct reviews like this? Stuff like that.
Absolutely. So I did train my team. Well, we kind of figured it out as we went, but we talked about it a lot as we were going through the interviews. But the second part I talked about with like creating your network through one-on-ones, it definitely has that power, right? There's a network effect. So we start having one-on-ones with people in different parts of especially the engineering org, right? That's where we have the most influence. Start creating those connections. And ideally, people's lights will come on their own, right? And they'll be like, I should start scheduling more one-on-ones with the SRE people because they have access to production. And when I screw up, I want them on my side. But sometimes it's better to be a little explicit. And like sometimes I'll say that, like, I'm scheduling a one-on-one because I'm building my network in this company. And this is what I've done at Elastic and said, and I really want to get to know some stuff about what's going on in legal, what's going on in sales, because that eventually does have an influence on my work.
Well, thank you very much. A hand for our speaker, Amy Tobey.